I gasped for breath, my body soaked through, like a drowning fish. A cool, gentle breeze blew by, and I suddenly came to my senses. Here, there was no intense heat. I trembled as I picked up my phone and checked the time. It was 2:03 a.m. on November 30th, 20XX. Only then did I truly believe and accept that I had been reborn 3 days before the outbreak of the extreme heat. I reached out and turned on the electric light. Feeling the brightness of the room in front of me and the gentle cold wind outside the window, I sobbed softly. In my previous life, within just 2 days of the extreme heat, the power and water supply had stopped. The high temperature had burned out the voltage, and the water had turned into boiling hot water, making it impossible to pump it up. Until the very last moment of my life, my eyes were still in complete darkness, and my lips were parched and cracked. I had been relying on my grandmother since I was a child. In my previous life, my grandmother passed away before me. In the second week of the extreme heat, a shelter was established in the city, and all the electricity was centrally supplied there. The elderly, the weak, the sick, the disabled, pregnant women, and those with children were sent there first, while young and middle-aged people stayed at home waiting for further arrangements from the state. My grandmother didn't want to go and wanted to stay at home with me. Seeing that she was on the verge of fainting from the heat, I desperately sent my grandmother to the shelter. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect that my decision would cost my grandmother her life. The infrastructure of the shelter was not perfect, and not all the elderly, weak, sick, and disabled people were as kind as they seemed. My grandmother was brutally beaten to death by a crazy woman. The woman came with her child, and thought that 1 bottle of water per person per day was not enough. Although she had already been allocated 2 bottles, she still tried to snatch my grandmother's. During the struggle, my grandmother spilled the water, and the child started crying loudly. The woman, driven mad with anger, began to beat my grandmother to vent her frustration. She was pushed into the corner by that woman and hit her head. I didn't hear any news about my grandmother for a week. Braving the extreme heat, I went there and only got this answer. Even worse, no one collected my grandmother's body, and it stank there. Oh, that old lady was Sokalan. It wasn't enough that her water was snatched away, and she was even knocked to death. My vision went black, and I stood there in a daze listening to those words. An accident? Killing someone by accident? I smiled bitterly. When I came to my senses, I grabbed the person next to me. Who did this? With the mentality of watching the drama, she tilted her mouth diagonally forward. I saw that woman. Her hair was as messy as a chicken coop. Her eyes were fierce, and she stared closely around, protecting the child in her arms who was crying loudly. My heart was ablaze with anger, and my body trembled with rage. Before I could get close, the security guards had already arrived and blocked her out of my sight. Hiding behind the guards, the woman avoided my gaze but spoke with a sense of righteousness. Is this my fault? My child was almost dying of thirst, and she wouldn't give me the water. Besides, I didn't do it on purpose. Why should I be blamed? She spoke with full confidence, holding her head high. How I wished I could kill her to avenge my grandmother. I hated her to the core. But the relevant personnel just said that they would talk about other matters after order was restored. A line of people blocked me, and the woman walked away nonchalantly behind the human wall. I wailed pitifully and asked the people who blocked me. She killed my grandmother. Why isn't she being punished? No one paid any attention to me. At this moment, the sound of footsteps approached. I saw a man as upright as a pine tree appear in front of me. He squatted down and looked at me, who was almost crying myself into a faint, and said to me in a low voice, I am the upcoming director of the Public Security Department in City H. Please trust me. I will handle all this for you. He looked at me, filled with sorrow, and said, just be a little more patient. The law will give you justice. I sobbed. Okay, I'll wait for you. What's your name? My name is Chiyu. Coming back to reality, everything in my previous life seemed like a nightmare I had. I wiped away my tears and stopped thinking about the painful memories of the past. I died too early in my previous life and didn't know if my grandmother had received justice. The face of that man appeared in front of my eyes again, and I felt a bit dejected. I clenched my fists. All of this was in the past. In this life, I will protect my grandmother and myself well. I can't do anything for others. In this apocalyptic world of extreme heat, which is even more terrifying than the zombie outbreak, I only wish for the safety of my grandmother and myself. It was already late at night, but I wasn't sleepy at all. I went out, rented a large truck, and headed to a large warehouse-style supermarket that was open 24 hours in the city. I started purchasing supplies. I didn't know how long this extreme heat would last before it could be effectively resolved, but it was always right to prepare in advance. I contacted the supermarket manager and explained my intention. Our company wants to donate supplies for the pandemic. The quantity is huge, so I'm contacting you directly. The manager showed understanding and asked me to fill out the purchase list. First of all, there were food supplies. After the extreme heat, all the crops would be parched to death, and families without supplies wouldn't have time to wait for the state's food supply. I bought 25 bags of 50-gene flour self-heating hot pots and self-heating rice. I also needed these. Even in the extreme heat, they could improve our taste. I ordered 5 boxes of biscuits and other snacks. And the most important thing was mineral water. I bought 500 boxes of 16-bottle mineral water, and 200 boxes of 24-bottle light salt water. Apart from the supermarket, I asked the truck driver to take me to an open pharmacy. I purchased 300 bottles of horrifying water. I also bought 100 boxes of cooling patches. Each box contained 10 patches, and there were 100 boxes in a case. Again, I used the reason of donating supplies. All the things were loaded onto the truck, and I had already decided where to put them. My grandmother still had a house in her hometown, which was a cave dwelling. It was warm in winter and cool in summer, an excellent place to escape the heat. However, we hadn't been back for many years, and it was in a state of disrepair. After driving for about half an hour, we arrived. The driver and I carried the boxes in one by one. But this wasn't enough. I still had some other things to do. With the morning sun and the weariness of the whole night, I returned home in a dusty state, which gave my grandmother a great shock. She was brushing her teeth and looked at me in surprise. "Nyonya, where have you been?" Seeing my healthy grandmother in front of me, I couldn't hold back my emotions and burst into tears with a sob. I told my grandmother everything I had experienced. I knew that my grandmother would definitely believe me. My grandmother didn't blame me. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she looked at me with pity. She knew that I had led a tough life alone after losing her in my previous life. In this life, I'm not going anywhere, my dear. My grandmother looked at the rising sun in the sky, thought for a while and said to me, "Nyonya, something is still missing." My grandmother said that during the extreme heat, we could only eat some food that was easy to store. We could do without big fish and meat, but it would be better to have some. So I drove my grandmother to the vegetable market and bought dozens of caddies of beef and mutton. Now, the supplies were finally sufficient. My grandmother asked me, "You've already put the things in the cave dwelling, right?" I nodded. I told my grandmother that in the future, we would both live in the cave dwelling in our hometown. Because the current community was on the top floor, once the extreme heat broke out, this location would be the first to suffer. On the way home, I contacted a housekeeping company and asked them to go and clean first. I used the same reason. To store the supplies to be donated soon. When we arrived, the housekeeping ants were already busy. Before long, the interior was habitable. The furniture was also not suitable. I asked my grandmother to take a rest first, and I went to the county town to buy brand new beds, furniture, and so on. I also bought cool bedding such as ice silk sheets and bamboo mats. In the afternoon, I contacted the renovation workers and replaced the gates and windows of the courtyard entrance and the cave dwelling. I chose the sturdiest and hardest materials that could effectively insulate the heat. As my grandmother watched the workers at work, she suddenly said that we should build a dry toilet. Before long, water would become a scarce resource, and we needed to save it. Flushing the toilet with water would obviously be unrealistic. After 5 workers arrived, I used the previous reason. My grandmother is old, and I'm away from home all year round, so I feel more at ease with this. The workers nodded and got busy. I watched from the side and handed them water. I held an umbrella and wore a hat. The warm sun shone on me, making me break out in a cold sweat. I only felt afraid. The glare of the sun made my eyes dizzy. It was the workers who noticed my abnormality. They gave me a hand when I was about to faint. I wiped the sweat and said thank you. They smiled and turned back to their work. With 1,000 thoughts in my mind, I still gritted my teeth and said, "Guys, don't you think the weather is getting more and more abnormal?" My eyes were fixed on their expressions. The workers all nodded. Indeed, it's getting hotter year by year. I heard that the feet of the big Buddha have been exposed. I quickly echoed, "Yes, I think so too. So we must stock up on more water and anti-heat stroke items at home. And go out less. It's too hot." The workers waved their hands. "Alas, we can't avoid going out for this job. Girl, you have a good rest. We'll be done soon." They smiled gently, but my tears suddenly fell. I quickly lowered my head and wiped them away. I looked up at the sun. There were still 2 days left. The next day, the renovation workers completed the work. I gave them an extra 5,000 yuan and told them to stock up on more water. I also bought a set of solar power generation equipment. Besides the solar panels, I also bought a large-scale generator. I used the same old reason. The workers installed them quickly. Taking advantage of this time, I asked my grandmother to watch at home, and I went to the mall to buy an air conditioner, 5 freezers, and a powerful ice-making machine. When I got home, the workers had already finished the installation. With a ding sound of power on, I looked at all the operating equipment and finally heaved a sigh of relief. My grandmother walked over slowly and handed me a bottle of water. I drank it slowly, while planning other things in my mind. In my previous life, I couldn't let go of my grandmother's death. I won't let that woman go. The child is innocent, but she isn't. In the extreme heat weather we can't go out. So I can only take advantage of the fact that it's not too hot yet, and make preparations early. I went to the mall hall that was used as an emergency shelter in my previous life. I came to the stone pillar where my grandmother was knocked to death, and placed a pinhole camera there. In fact, in my previous life, there were also surveillance cameras in the mall. Because of the centralized power supply, there was no power outage here. But no one let me watch the surveillance video. No one cared about death. After all, it wasn't themselves or their own family members who died. And this time, I prepared the evidence myself. Even if my grandmother doesn't come this time, there will be others. With cloud connection, I can see every move of anyone in all places clearly. Baby, do you want to play on the rocking car? I suddenly heard a voice I would never forget. It was the woman from my previous life. She was pushing a stroller, smiling affectionately. My whole body trembled suddenly. I tried my best to control my body, and stopped myself from rushing up to kill her. But she was a devil and I wasn't. I would use the weapon of the law to protect myself. I believe that this natural disaster will eventually be under control. As long as I have the evidence, she won't escape punishment. There was still one day left. As the time approached, my grandmother became more and more worried, always feeling that the anti-heat items were not enough. Ñoño, I'll go to the pharmacy again to see what else I can buy. My grandmother went to the pharmacy in the neighboring town. Since this was the place where my grandmother was born and raised, I felt at ease letting my grandmother go out alone. She was gone for 3 hours and didn't come back. And in the cave dwelling, which was like winter, I suddenly felt the terrifying, rising temperature. I held my breath, and fumbled to open the weather forecast. The temperature was 30 degrees. The extreme heat had arrived early. At the same time, a warning text message was sent. Dear citizens, please stay at home and do not go out. The weather is abnormal. Pay attention to safety and purchase supplies. I fumbled to take off my cotton-padded clothes. Without time to think about why the extreme heat had arrived early, I rushed out of the door in a hurry. My grandmother hadn't come back yet. As soon as I went out, the hot air tightly choked my throat, making it difficult for me to breathe. I quickly drove to the pharmacy that my grandmother often went to. The high temperature was approaching 40 degrees. The pharmacy was crowded with people at the moment, and there were constant curses and noises of pushing and shoving. My grandmother had indeed had an accident. I saw that my grandmother was tightly holding a bag, which contained the medicine she bought, and the bag was being snatched by another man. You old woman, why do you buy so much? Isn't it enough for yourself? Everyone come and take a look. There's still some here. We can just take some and give her the money. My grandmother's helpless expression, with her hunched body, was unable to resist feebly. No, it's not enough for the 6 people in my family. They swarmed over. My grandmother was reluctant, and then she was kicked hard. To make her let go, I rushed in like a mad person. In front of my eyes was the image of my grandmother's stiff and cold body in my previous life. I took the dagger in the car that was used for self-defense. Get out! All of you get out! I screamed and rushed into the swarming crowd, running towards my grandmother. My grandmother was slapped hard by the snatching man. My grandmother let out a scream of pain and fear. I stood in front of my grandmother. I didn't know where the great strength came from. I snatched the bag in one go. Like a mad person, I roared and screamed and slapped hard. Beast! The man cursed and covered his face. But I still didn't feel relieved. I waved the dagger. Stay away from me. I panted heavily and stared at the man. I rushed up, and he dodged in a hurry. I waved the dagger again and again. He was scratched a few times by me, but not seriously injured. But there were still people who wouldn't give up, and wanted to snatch the medicine, while taking advantage of the chaos. I waved the dagger quickly and forcefully. The dagger brought a cold wind as it swished. They were scared back. Within a few meters around, no one dared to approach anymore. They were all watching the show. The man who had snatched the medicine at first made a phone call, and 3 strong men walked in from outside the pharmacy. The man looked at me viciously. You little brat is so tough. Today, I'm going to snatch it anyway. He spat. Damn it, I originally wanted to buy it, but you didn't give me the chance. I stared at him coldly. I held my grandmother tightly in my arms. My grandmother wrapped her arms around me. She didn't look around. She just cried and said, Ñoño, are you okay? Does it hurt? I stroked my grandmother's head and shook my head. My grandmother cried bitterly. She broke free from my embrace and stood in front of me. She was afraid that her little granddaughter would be beaten. There were 4 strong men standing around. I looked around. There wasn't a single person willing to help. In the neighborhood, there were not a few people who knew my grandmother. I saw several familiar faces, but they just looked on in horror, and then quickly walked away. I knew I shouldn't blame them, but I really hated it. My grandmother was a kind-hearted person. She would help the neighbors whenever she could. If she couldn't, she would find a way to help. Was this the return she got? I closed my eyes in despair. I once again firmly believed in my own thoughts, and felt ridiculous for my own compassion. They gradually approached. I was slapped and kicked. I didn't make a sound. I just held my grandmother tightly to ensure her safety. Suddenly, a man stood in front of me. He was dressed in black and punched the opposite side. I heard a cold laugh. Bullying the elderly and children. What kind of a man are you? This familiar voice made me suddenly come to my senses. It was Chiyu. He He stood in front of my grandmother and me. He punched one person away. His body was strong, and his fists were powerful. We were firmly protected. My nose felt sour. Before long, the crowd dispersed. The police swarmed in and handcuffed the troublemakers. Are you okay? I was helped up by Chiyu. I wiped my tears and shook my head. I looked at his stern eyebrows. But it was too hot. His whole body was soaked with sweat, and his face was red. I took out 2 boxes of cooling patches, and 2 boxes of Huoxiang Jingqi water, from the things my grandmother bought, and gave them to him. He smiled and only took the cooling patches. The weather is abnormally hot. You'd better go back first. As long as you're okay. I asked my grandmother to go back to the car and wait for me first. I looked at Chiyu hesitantly. Chiyu saw my hesitation. Are you not feeling well? I said. Why are you here? He was stunned. Then I remembered that at this moment, I had no connection with him. Chiyu scratched his head and smiled honestly. Do you know me? I nodded and then shook my head. Although I didn't know the result in my previous life, I was already grateful that he was willing to help me. I took out 5 boxes of cooling patches and stuffed them all to him. The weather is abnormally hot. You can keep these for backup. You won't be able to buy them in the future. Without looking at his expression, I turned around and went back. After getting in the car and feeling the cool air from the air conditioner, I finally had the energy to think. I didn't tell my grandmother about the early arrival of the extreme heat. I was just thinking about whether my rebirth had caused it to arrive early. Fortunately, the supplies were already ready. As the sun set and the sky darkened, the temperature broke through again and reached 46 degrees. My grandmother and I closed the door tightly and pulled the curtains. Just as we were about to turn on the air conditioner, our vision suddenly went dark. With the occasional screams from outside, my heart slowly sank. The power and water supply were about to be cut off. My grandmother and I started the generator to power the air conditioner and used the heat energy stored by the solar energy to power the freezer. The air conditioner blew a gentle cold wind. Even when it was adjusted to the lowest temperature of 16 degrees, it was only a little cooler. It was like the wind blown by a fan in summer. I took out the ice cubes from the ice, making machine and filled 2 basins. I placed them in front of the air conditioner blades. My grandmother and I both put on cooling patches. Only then did we feel a little better. I took out 2 bottles of water for my grandmother, but my grandmother didn't want to drink. You drink it. Grandma isn't thirsty. The old lady looked at me seriously. I couldn't help but laugh and cry. Come on, we're not short of water. Drink with confidence. My grandmother still didn't drink. So I took her to the place where the supplies were stored at the back. Half of the freezer was filled with water, and the bottled water on the ground was stacked almost as high as the ceiling. This amount of water was sufficient to last us a year. My grandmother finally felt at ease and began to sip the water, her eyes filled with tenderness and shintung. I looked at her with a mix of amusement and affection. In the following days we stayed at home, venturing nowhere. From time to time, hoarse screams echoed from the streets, followed by the shattering sound of glass. I parted the curtains slightly to peek outside. Many people, driven to despair by the lack of food and water in their homes, had resorted to hanging themselves. Moreover, cases of burglary were occurring more and more frequently. Despite the intense heat, in a desperate bid for survival, those with nothing to eat were turning to robbery. In a moment of disillusionment, it seemed as if civilization had regressed 1,000 years in an instant. My grandmother let out a sigh, having witnessed the harrowing scene outside. Her back hunched, she let the curtains fall, no longer able to bear the sight. She returned to the bed and lay down, and I caught a glimpse of her secretly wiping away tears with her hand. That night, as we were preparing to go to bed, a loud bang suddenly came from outside the door. Someone was pounding on our door. I immediately rushed to look outside, and was horrified to find the 4 burly men, who had robbed my grandmother that day. They were wielding an extremely thick wooden club, slamming it forcefully against the door. And surrounding them, I also saw Chiyu, who was on the verge of death. Chiyu lay on the ground, his face bruised and swollen, gasping for breath. Blood covered his face, and he looked as if he was about to pass away at any moment. My heart skipped a beat. My grandmother saw him too, and knowing who Chiyu was, she was extremely anxious. What should we do? How can we save you? I murmured to myself. We couldn't open the door without driving those men away, and Chiyu could only wait helplessly for death. I thought anxiously. By now, the 4 men outside had been wielding the wooden club for 15 minutes. Evidently, they were running out of strength. In the sweltering environment with the temperature exceeding 50 degrees, they were constantly jumping up as they were burned. Panting heavily, they were clearly suffering terribly from the heat. I glanced around and suddenly spotted something. I gritted my teeth and stared at the men outside, who were attempting to break into our home. Remembering their previous actions and my grandmother's ordeal, and thinking that if it hadn't been for Chiyu that day, we might not even be alive now. So, I decided that I, as a fearless woman, would rid the people of these pests. I picked up the scrap glass that I had replaced the day before, and opened the door of the cave dwelling. As soon as I opened the door, a searing wave of heat rushed towards me, and I felt as if I was about to be knocked unconscious by the intense heat. I placed the glass at the door. After waiting for 5 minutes, I braved the scorching heat, and climbed up the ladder. My hands were burned with blisters, and rashes appeared on my face due to the heat. Had it really been only 50 degrees outside? I thought in a daze. But there was no time for me to ponder now. Damn it. That old woman and that bitch. When I get inside, I'll rape her first and then kill her. Boss, we'll do as you say, haha. They tried to find some humor in their misery and chuckled. I sneered as well. They were standing closely together, which conveniently worked to my advantage. I threw the glass down at them. Amidst their screams, I quickly stepped back into the house. Bitch! Bitch! I had smeared the glass with super glue 502, and now it clung tightly to their bodies. One of them was still able to speak. After waiting for 3 minutes, there was no sound outside. I went out with a dagger, crouched down, and felt for their breaths. They were all unconscious. My grandmother and I dragged them by their feet and threw them aside. I had no regrets about treating them this way. I wasn't a naive and overly kind person. All I hoped for was the safety of my grandmother and myself. Ñoño, come quickly. Goodness. I had actually forgotten about Chiyu. I rushed over and dragged Chiyu into the house. We closed the door tightly, locked it, and then put 2 large locks on the door of the cave dwelling. After all the security measures were in place, Chiyu lay with his eyes tightly closed, his face flushed red. He had been fainted by the heat. In such high temperatures, what was more terrifying than heatstroke was heatstroke. Chiyu had been exposed to the sun for so long, and we didn't know if there was any damage to his internal organs. My grandmother and I were not doctors, so we could only try to cool him down first and observe his condition after he woke up. My grandmother first dipped a towel in cold water and wiped Chiyu's body. She took off all his clothes. At first, I felt a bit embarrassed because of my shyness, but my grandmother said, "What's there to be embarrassed about? Saving a life is the most important thing." Putting aside my unnecessary thoughts, I fed him light salt water and forced him to drink Huxiang Jingqi water. We placed ice cubes around him and put a cooling patch on the back of his neck. Chiyu's body temperature finally dropped slightly, and his face gradually regained its normal color. Half an hour passed, and my grandmother and I were feeling a bit drowsy. Just as we were about to take a short nap, Chiyu woke up. "You, where am I?" Chiyu supported his forehead, and my grandmother quickly handed him a glass of water. "Are you okay, little Chi?" My grandmother's eagerness made my eyebrows twitch. I quickly dashed over, wanting to cover my grandmother's mouth. "Grandma, little Chi, you're not married yet, are you?" I put my hand on my forehead. Even in the apocalypse, my grandmother's gossipy nature didn't stop. Chiyu was taken aback and stammered, "No, I'm not." I quickly said, "Grandma, Chiyu is sick. Don't bother him." My grandmother pouted and snickered. Chiyu then realized something and asked, "How do you know my name?" He was somewhat puzzled. To prevent him from thinking too much, I quickly asked him how he had fallen into the hands of those 4 burly men. It turned out that after the 4 men were taken to the police station, they were found to be fugitive criminals on the run. The police were about to deal with them when the extreme heat broke out, causing chaos. They took the opportunity to escape, and even took their own files with them. Chiyu was driving to the city for a meeting, and those 4 men were hiding in the police car. Due to his own carelessness, he was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, Chiyu found that they had returned to the small town. Chiyu engaged in a struggle with them, and was knocked unconscious in front of my house. After hearing this, my grandmother invited Chiyu to stay with us and feel at ease. Chiyu originally wanted to refuse, and go to retrieve the fugitives' files. I said quietly, "Are the files on those 4 men?" Chiyu nodded. "Then come with me. They should still be outside the door." Chiyu retrieved the files and scratched his head. I played back the surveillance video from earlier. He asked me to keep it safe as evidence for the future. After that, he suddenly realized and looked at the equipment and supplies in our house. The relaxed expression on his face disappeared instantly, and he looked at me with a scrutinizing gaze. My grandmother and I exchanged a glance. I had no choice but to explain. In fact, when I saw Chiyu, I had already decided to save him, and didn't plan to hide the truth from him. The idea of reincarnation and coming back to life was too incredible, and it was up to him whether to believe it or not. Chiyu was stunned for a long time. "You mean in your previous life I also helped you?" he asked, looking at me. I nodded. I died too early to know what happened next, nor did I know if my grandmother received justice. Hearing what I said, Chiyu's expression became serious. He looked at my grandmother and me solemnly and said, "I don't know about what happened in your previous life, but I know that since I, Chiyu, have promised you, I will keep my word." His eyes were so determined that my heart, which had been cold with the memories of the past, felt a little soothed. My grandmother wiped away her tears and said, "Little Chi is a good boy. We believe in you." Thus, Chi stayed with us. The supplies my grandmother and I had were more than enough to support the 3 of us. To repay him for saving our lives, my grandmother had been very busy these days, preparing snacks, fruits, main courses, and hot pots. She almost treated him like a future grandson-in-law. I just grinned stupidly, pretending not to notice. 2 months passed in the blink of an eye. During this period, Chiyu had gained 5 pounds while staying at our house. He and my grandmother practiced Tai Chi, military boxing, and gymnastics every day. He also served as an electrical appliance repairman. He could fix anything that was broken in our house, which made my grandmother beam with joy. I felt like an outsider. "Grandma, what are we having for dinner tonight?" I asked her. "We'll have whatever little Chi wants to eat." I gave my grandmother a resentful look. My grandmother looked at Chi-Yu and giggled. Chi-Yu turned around, looked at me, and also giggled. Let's have what Sharon wants to eat. I'll eat whatever Sharon has. The next moment, Chi-Yu went to my grandmother and offered to help with cutting the vegetables. My grandmother waved her hands happily. Oh, don't tire yourself out. I can do it. You go and rest. Chi-Yu said. It's okay, Grandma. I'm good at cutting vegetables. My grandmother was overjoyed. I watched the man who had stolen my grandmother's affection from behind and sneered. I turned on the radio and tuned in to the daily emergency news on time. I was waiting for an announcement. Notice. Notice. The city shelter has been completed. Power supply will be prioritized there. The elderly, the weak, the sick, the disabled, pregnant women, and residents with children will be given priority. Young and middle-aged people, please stay at home and wait for rescue. It was finally completed. I took a deep breath and turned on the pinhole camera that I had placed in the mall in advance. The image came through, and I stared at it intently. Ran, it's time for dinner. It was only when my grandmother called me that I put down my phone. During this period, I had been waiting patiently. I was unaware of the time when my grandmother had died in my previous life, so I couldn't afford to miss any moment. I took a deep breath and suddenly met Chi-Yu's gaze. He averted his eyes abruptly, which left me rather bewildered. After having our meal, I pulled him aside and asked him to watch the surveillance with me. Having a police chief at hand, it would be a waste not to make use of him. Chi-Yu knew about this matter, so he didn't question why I had installed the camera. He heaved a sigh. I looked up at him and asked, "What's wrong?" Just then, I happened to see his raised hand. Something suddenly dawned on me in my mind. Was he about to pat my head? Chi-Yu maintained a poker-faced expression and said, "What? My head suddenly itches. I'm just scratching it." My face turned dark. Fine. I had been oversensitive. I quietly moved a distance of 5 centimeters away, but he moved closer again. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my inexplicably fluttering heartbeat. He suddenly reminded me seriously. Ran, look. I quickly looked over, ignoring the affectionate way he called my name. That woman, the woman who had killed my grandmother in my previous life, was walking around aimlessly with her child in her arms. She was looking for a target. In the spot where my grandmother had been before, there was an even frilier old man sitting. The old man was completely defenseless, tremblingly trying to unscrew the bottle cap. She snatched it away in one go. My grandmother held her breath and leaned over to watch. Her hands were shaking with fear. I tightly held my grandmother's hand. Grandma, this is the evidence. I failed to obtain it in my previous life, but in this life, I will get justice for you. My grandmother's eyes were filled with tears, and she nodded vigorously. Chi took out his phone and silently started recording. He saved it on his phone. If the camera in the mall is discovered, at least we have a backup. I nodded. The woman looked panicked, eager to grab the water and leave quickly. But the old man held on tightly and refused to let go. The child started crying again, wailing loudly. At this moment, the shelter was in chaos. No one was looking in their direction. The old man exclaimed in horror. What are you doing? The woman gritted her teeth and remained silent. In the struggle, the water spilled, soaking their clothes. The same old story was repeating itself. She flew into a rage. You old hag. It's all gone. Do you know there's only 1 bottle of water per person? She shrieked. Suddenly, she slapped the old man. Still not satisfied, she then banged the old man's head 3 times. Finally, she seemed to have vented her anger. But the old man was silent. The woman realized something and nervously checked the old man's breath. In a panic, she covered her mouth and left with her child. The empty water bottle rolled on the ground and came back to the old man's feet. Only one person around noticed this, the aunt who had told me in my previous life. The woman fled, and the next moment, the camera feed cut off, and the monitor went black. There was a hissing sound of electricity, and it couldn't be turned on anymore. I held my phone, my hands shaking. I thanked Chi-Yu with lingering fear. Thank you. If it weren't for you, I couldn't continue. At this moment, Chi-Yu patted my head. He had made 3 backups and sent 1 to me. With everything settled, my heart suddenly relaxed, and I even felt a bit breathless. After such extreme emotional ups and downs, my face was covered with snot and tears. I sobbed and wailed, tightly hugging my grandmother. Fortunately, in this life, I hadn't let my grandmother repeat the same tragic fate. As my grandmother and I embraced and wept, I also felt a warm embrace. I looked over in a daze. Chi-Yu's eyes were red too. My heart skipped a beat, and I understood something. But I didn't say anything. We remained silent, neither of us speaking. 7. After that, the relationship between Chi-Yu and me became somewhat awkward. Specifically, we only talked normally when my grandmother was around. When my grandmother was absent, the 2 of us in our 20s would just look at each other, without saying a word. I could see the pink flesh on the tips of his ears and his emotions. But I was always very troubled. Could there really be pure feelings in such a short time? Or was it because we were trapped here and couldn't move around freely, and he only interacted with me? So some ambiguous atmosphere had naturally developed? In these 2 lifetimes, I had never been in a relationship. I was extremely cautious. These days continued for over a month. The sweltering heat of the sun persisted. Suddenly my grandmother fell ill, running a high fever that wouldn't subside. I took her temperature, fearing it might not be accurate, but her forehead was indeed burning hot. I was in a panic. My grandmother was too unsure to speak. I wiped her body to dissipate the heat and gave her medicine. Every hour, I used alcohol for physical cooling. She wanted to help, but I refused and told him to go cook. He cooked porridge and fried an egg, feeding them to my grandmother. But by late at night, my grandmother still hadn't woken up. I started to have wild thoughts. I grabbed Chiyu's hand and sobbed. Why is this happening? Why? I had clearly done my best, and my grandmother hadn't been hurt. I was so afraid that my grandmother would leave me that my whole body was trembling. I cried until my head was dizzy, and I didn't have the strength to open my eyes. When my head was splitting with pain, I felt a gentle kiss land on my forehead, but I didn't have the strength to open my eyes. I just weakly held his hand. In my heart I thought, Grandma, don't leave me. If you really have to go, I'll go with you. Finally, I was able to open my eyes. I saw Chiyu carefully wiping my grandmother's body just like I did. After that, he started to feed her medicine. A boy over 1 meter, 90 was huddled in a corner, squeezing the water out of a towel. Then he took the temperature again, and let out a sigh of relief. In Chiyu's surprised eyes, I got out of bed and placed my palm on my grandmother's forehead. Fortunately, she wasn't feverish anymore. My grandmother was sleeping soundly, and I finally felt at ease. Looking back at Chiyu's surprised eyes, I couldn't help but laugh. I patted his head, and his expression suddenly turned aggrieved. He asked nervously, Sharon, you don't feel bad anymore, do you? I deliberately furrowed my brows and said, a little bit. He was shocked and said, then you go and rest. I'll take care of it. I burst out laughing. At this point I stopped being awkward. In his incredulous eyes, I held his hand. I said, you fool. He suddenly moved very close to me. I closed my eyes, and then I heard my grandmother cough. We were startled and quickly moved 10 meters apart, our faces flushed. Chiyu scratched his head awkwardly, and then went to my grandmother's side. Grandma, are you feeling better? When I heard him call her grandma, I quickly wanted to stop him. My grandmother frowned at me, and I dared not say anything. Good boy, Grandma is fine. Just as my grandmother finished speaking, a loud bang came from outside. Boom! I quickly opened the curtain. Outside, it was thundering. The sun was gone, and after half a year, rain finally fell on the earth. 8. After the rain, the temperature dropped to 45 degrees. More and more national shelters were built, and their facilities were perfect. After that, humans would live there in groups to get through the natural disaster. In the following week, everything began to come back to life. The first blade of grass after the severe drought grew in the courtyard. Chiyu and I made an appointment to go to the police station. But this time, he looked extremely handsome in his police uniform, just like when I first saw him. I submitted the evidence and served as a witness. That woman was sent to prison. Until she was handcuffed, the woman was still arguing. Why are you arresting me? Why blame me? It was his poor health. Officer. I stared coldly at the woman, meeting her gaze. She lunged at me with a shout while wearing handcuffs, but I wasn't afraid at all. Chiyu stepped in front of me. I stared at her and said, justice may be delayed, but it will never be absent. You should have been punished by law long ago. She was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. This time she couldn't escape. Chiyu saw me home. When we got home, my grandmother could tell what had happened just by looking at my flushed face. The old lady chuckled. The natural disaster really brought me a grandson-in-law.